Hello. Welcome back to yet another unique unit overview. I have had the pleasure of being able to play the Mongols a whole lot recently, and it felt only natural for me to overview their unique unit, which is the Mangudai. However, when you look at the Mangudai, you also really need to compare it to another unit that the Mongols have bonuses for, which would be the Heavy Cavalry Archer. The Heavy Cavalry Archer is really a unit that's not used very often. However, the bonus of faster attack speed means that it's way more viable for the Mongols to use it than for another civilization. However, the Mongols also have the Elite Mangudai, and they need to determine when they should use that unit or they should use the Heavy Cavalry Archer. And that is what this video is going to be about. Elite Mangudai and Heavy Cavalry Archers are really good units because they have a relatively fast fire rate and a pretty high attack, meaning they have a high damage output. They're relatively tanky because they have a pretty good HP and some good armor. And both of these units are much faster than normal archers such as arbalests or hand cannoneers, which means it's a lot easier to keep these units safe. However, you need to look at the specifics of each of these units in order to tell when to use each one. And boy, do their stats look similar. They both have 80 HP. The Elite Mangudai has 12 attack while the Heavy Cavalry Archer has 1 less at 11. They both have 4 of each armor, and they both have 7 range. However, there are some hidden things that I want to look at. The first is that the Elite Mangudai have +5 attack versus siege weapons, and they have a +3 attack versus the halberdier line after Parthian tactics. The Heavy Cavalry Archer, on the other hand, has no bonus damage versus siege, but it has twice the bonus damage versus the halberdier line after Parthian tactics. Also, the Elite Mangudai is a little more expensive at 55 wood and 65 gold versus the Heavy Cavalry Archer's 40 wood and 60 gold. And so, at first glance, this information suggests that there will be some situations where you'll want to make the Mangudai and others where you'll want to make the Heavy Cavalry Archer. So let's look at 3 situations. The first situation would be which army would have the highest damage output. Or, in other words, which army would be the most dangerous. Now, because of the way the gold price works, for every 13 Heavy Cavalry Archers you make, you'll only be able to make 12 Mangudai. Guys, this is a 1 unit difference. It's really not that big. And if you take the total amount of damage shot by the Heavy Cavalry Archer and look at the total damage shot by the Mangudai, it's basically the same. Now, if you looked at this from a perspective of wood, it would be better for the Heavy Cavalry Archer, because for every 11 of those you can field, you would only be able to field 8 Mangudai. However, the reality is that the wood cost of this unit really isn't that important, because if you're in a situation where it's very hard to get gold, but not hard to get wood, you would not be wanting to make the Mangudai anyways. Instead, you'd want to go with the Mongol siege. And so when it comes to price, if you're going to look at it from a strict, long-term damage output potential, I'm going to have to give them a tie. However, let's look at its performance versus infantry, because there is some different bonus damages going on. At first, it would seem like the Heavy Cavalry Archer would be better because they have the higher bonus damage versus halberdiers, especially after Parthian tactics. However, I need to point out that even though they both fire at the same rate of fire, the Mangudai shoots first. In other words, when you tell it to attack a unit, its arrow will fly before the Heavy Cavalry Archers. And this really does change the outcome of battles in many situations, because it means it's way easier to micro the Mangudai than it is to micro the Heavy Cavalry Archer. In reality, the Halberdier is such a low HP unit that the extra bonus damage from the Heavy Cavalry Archer really does not negate the extra speed that you get using the Mangudai. And so I'm going to give this point to the Mangudai. And finally, versus Siege, it's pretty obvious that this is yet another win for the Mangudai. It's commonly known that in Age of Empires 2, if you want to counter the Heavy Cavalry Archer, Onagers and Rams will be pretty good choices. However, let me explain why with the Mangudai, the same thing's not quite as true. If you look at how many units it takes to one-shot a generic Siege Onager with the Mangudai, it takes only 8 of them. With the Heavy Cavalry Archer, it's 24. What this means in an actual game is that it's going to be way easier for the Siege Onager to deal damage to the Heavy Cavalry Archer than it will be to deal damage to the Mangudai, therefore making them way less dangerous to the Mangudai. If you're trying to one-shot Heavy Scorpions, you'll only need 5 Mangudai, while you'll need 17 Heavy Cavalry Archers. For Bombard Cannons, it's 7 for the Mangudai, and twice that for the Heavy Cavalry Archers. And in order to two-shot Rams, you only need 27 Mangudai, which is compared to the 135 Heavy Cavalry Archers you'll need to two-shot Rams. And I couldn't really even test this, because this is what math said it should be, however, it's really not anything I could test. The point is still made, though, that Mangudai are way better versus Siege than the Heavy Cavalry Archer are. The results of this would be that while the Heavy Cavalry Archer is still pretty good for the Mongols because of their increased fire rate, the Mangudai would still be way better because they perform better versus Siege and Infantry. Mangudai are also very good against gunpowder, they're also good at raiding, and hit and running. The only time I can think of where I'd want to make Heavy Cavalry Archers as the Mongols instead of Elite Mangudai would be when it's really difficult for me to get castles up. So for example, at the very start of a deathmatch game, if I still want to snipe a few enemy villagers. However, in the vast majority of situations, the Elite Mangudai will be a vastly superior unit to use. Now, if you're facing off against a Mongol player, you will most likely find this unit, so you'll need to know what counter. The first unit I tested were Arbalests, because they do decently well versus Heavy Cavalry Archers. However, they really don't do too well versus Mangudai, and I guess that this is just because of the slightly higher attack. In all honesty, it's really almost an even trade, maybe a little bit in the favor of the Mangudai, and in which numbers would be the deciding factor. Paladins and Camels are generally pretty good counters versus Mangudais. However, the Mangudais can micro against these units, especially if you can put the Mangudais in a tight position where the Paladins and the Camels can't really get to them. The Mangudais also countered a little bit by trash units because of the bonus damage that they have against them. However, the reality is that if you just add a few siege weapons and maybe some hussars, you're really going to do very fine against trash units as the Mongols. So what this means is that if you're against Elite Mangudai and you don't have camels or paladins, you're going to need to try to use some unique units. Some unique units that work some of the time are Eagle Warriors, Kamyuks, and Samurai because of the bonus damages and various armors they have against that unit. However, some micro will help, and just a little bit of siege will really turn the tide of battle. However, many of the unique units that deal pierce damage will be very good against Elite Mangudai, such as Genoese crossbowmen, plumed archers, Chukonu, longbowmen, rattan archers, and ballista elephants, elephant archers, war wagons, camel archers, and genitors. However, you have to point out that these are all archer units, which are going to get countered very well by onagers, camels, and hussars. If instead you have a melee unique unit, that would be the Mamelukes, Huskarls, elephants, or boyars, these will also work pretty well against the Mongols, but again you have to keep in mind that they have siege, camels, and hussars, which for the most part will do pretty well against these units. Now I hope you've been noticing a trend here, that if a unit counters the Mangudai, it's generally countered back by either onagers, camels, and occasionally hussars. And this really does go to show not just the power of the Elite Mangudai, but the power of the post-imperial Mongol army. I think that this is probably why the Mongols are a fan-favorite civilization in Age of Empires 2 HD, because they have a very strong army that's fast and agile and is very good at keeping itself alive. However, one last thing to note though, would be that in order to effectively use the Mongol army and the Elite Mangudai in general, you will need to be able to micro these units, because many of the units that they counter, they do so only because they can run away and hit and run against these units. And this means that it can be pretty difficult to use the Mongol army at times if you're not very experienced with microing these units. So I want to give you some caution there before you think that the Mongol army is so strong, because you only need a few units to counter almost everything. You need units, but you also need to be paying attention. I guess that's really all I have to say about the Heavy Cavalry Archer and the Elite Mangudai for the Mongols. They're both really good choices, but the Mangudai really is the superior choice that you should use in just about every situation. Thanks for watching, and I hope that you have found this video useful.